Emma never considered herself a political person. News about inflation, trade deals, and economic policies always seemed distant, something debated in Parliament, far removed from her morning coffee and rent payments. As long as she could afford her small comforts, what did it really matter? But lately, something had changed. Prices at the supermarket had crept up so gradually that she barely noticed at first. A few pence here, a few pence there, until suddenly her usual grocery run cost £5, then £10 more than it used to. Electricity bills arrived with numbers that made her wince. Even her bus fare had ticked upward. She wasn't alone in this. Everyone around her seemed to be feeling the squeeze. The cost of living crisis had moved from headlines to reality, and it wasn't slowing down. What's happening? The UK is in the grip of a cost of living crisis, where everyday essentials, food, energy, rent are becoming unaffordable for many. Inflation has surged to a decades-high level, wages have barely moved, and people are struggling to keep up. But it's not just about money, it's about choices. Do you heat your home or buy groceries? Do you cut back on meals so your child can have enough? These are the impossible questions families across the country are now facing. The numbers tell a sobering story. Food prices have jumped over 10% in just a year. Energy bills have doubled for some households. Rents are skyrocketing, forcing many out of their homes. For those already living paycheck to paycheck, the pressure is relentless. But how did we get here? Why is everything more expensive? Several forces have collided to create the perfect economic storm. Inflation. Prices are rising faster than wages, making it harder to afford even the basics. Trade and tariffs. Post-Brexit trade changes and new international tariffs have made imports, like food and fuel, far more expensive. Supply chain disruptions. COVID-19, border delays, and global conflicts have slowed deliveries and increased costs across industries. Energy crisis. Global fuel shortages, worsened by geopolitical tensions, have sent energy prices soaring. Some households are now paying twice as much for heating as they did last year. It wasn't just numbers on a government report anymore. It was affecting real people, real businesses, real lives. And Emma was about to see just how deep the crisis ran. A simple trip, or so she thought. That Sunday morning, Emma followed her usual ritual, pulling on her thickest jumper, stepping into the crisp London air, and strolling to Mr. Patel's corner shop for groceries. It was a small routine, one that felt comfortable, unshaken by the world's problems. But today, something would be different. Something was waiting for her behind the glass doors of that tiny shop. A small moment, so simple, so ordinary, was about to shift the way she saw everything. She just didn't know it yet. Emma pushed open the glass door of Mr. Patel's corner shop, letting the warm air rush over her as the familiar bell chimed overhead. The shop smelled of fresh bread and ground coffee, the same comforting scent that had greeted her for years. She had been coming here since she moved into her tiny flat down the road, always preferring it over the big supermarkets. It felt personal, friendly, reliable. But today, as she grabbed a basket and made her way down the narrow aisles, something felt off. She reached for her usual half-dozen eggs and then froze. The price had changed. £2. Her brow furrowed. Weren't they £2.19 just last week? She checked the other shelves. The bread had gone up too. Butter was nearly £1 a pack. Even her favourite tea was creeping toward a price she didn't want to think about. Emma let out a breath and turned toward the counter. Mr. Patel was stacking newspapers, his usual kind smile a little dimmer than usual. "Morning, Emma," he said, his voice warm but weary. She held up the carton of eggs. "Tell me I'm imagining things. These were cheaper last time, right?" Mr. Patel sighed, wiping his hands on his apron. "You're not imagining it, love. Everything's going up." Emma frowned. "Why? I mean, I know prices have been rising, but this much, this fast." Mr. Patel gave a small, tired shrug. "Where do I even start? Suppliers are charging more. Import costs have gone up. The fuel to transport all this, that's up too. And tariffs. Don't get me started on tariffs." Emma's stomach twisted. She had read about the rising cost of living, but this was different. This was real. This was her breakfast, her routine, her money slipping through her fingers. "People aren't shopping like they used to," Mr. Patel continued. "Some regulars come in, look at the prices, and walk straight back out. I don't blame them. I've had to cut my own costs just to keep this place running. Emma glanced around. The shelves weren't as full as they used to be. She'd never noticed before, but now it was obvious. Even the shop was struggling. She paid for her groceries, feeling an unfamiliar tightness in her chest. If she was feeling this, what about families with kids? What about people on minimum wage? Stepping outside, she hugged the paper bag against her chest, her mind buzzing. The crisis wasn't some abstract, distant thing. It was here. It was happening. And if things were already this bad, how much worse could they get? As Emma walked home, the cold air stung her cheeks, but she barely noticed. Her mind was racing. If a small shop like Mr. Patel's was struggling, what about everyone else? She thought of her friend Sam, a mechanic who had been complaining about car parts taking weeks to arrive. Then there was her brother, who worked in logistics. He had mentioned shipping costs skyrocketing. Even her office had started cutting back, talking about budget adjustments that no one wanted to explain. The cost of living crisis wasn't just about groceries. It was everywhere. Families on the edge. Emma pulled her phone from her pocket and scrolled through the news. The headlines were bleak. More families turning to food banks as grocery prices soar. Energy bills set to rise again, millions brace for another increase. Businesses shutting down as costs become unbearable. She thought of the mother she had seen at the shop last week, hesitating at the till before putting back a carton of milk. At the time, Emma hadn't thought much of it, but now she realized that people were having to make impossible choices every single day. Eat or pay rent, heat or buy school supplies for their kids. And the worst part? There was no quick fix. Businesses fighting to survive. When Emma got home, she made a cup of tea, half a teaspoon less than usual, as if that would somehow stretch the tin a little longer. She thought about Mr. Patel's words. People aren't shopping like they used to. If small businesses couldn't afford to keep their shelves stocked and customers couldn't afford to buy what was left, how long before these shops started closing for good? She had already seen it happening. The cafe near her office had shut down last month. The laundrette down the street had a for sale sign in the window. Even big retailers were laying off staff. The crisis was pulling everything down with it. The wages that don't stretch. Emma worked in marketing, not a high-paying job, but enough to live on. Or at least it used to be. Her paycheck hadn't changed, but her bills had. She thought about people earning minimum wage. If she was struggling, how were they even getting by? Rent had gone up. Council tax had gone up. Even a takeaway coffee felt like a luxury now. The numbers didn't add up anymore. And yet the government's response seemed slow. News reports talked about long-term solutions, but what about now? What were people supposed to do in the meantime? No one is immune. Emma had always assumed financial struggles were something that happened to other people, people in different circumstances, different situations. But now, the crisis was creeping into everyone's lives, little by little. And if things kept going this way, how much worse could it get? Emma stared at her receipt, still crumpled in her pocket from earlier. £2.79 for eggs, £4.99 for butter. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about what it meant. If everything kept getting more expensive, where would it end? How much could people cut back before there was nothing left to cut? She wasn't the type to panic, but for the first time, she felt a knot of unease that wouldn't go away. Something had to change. The fight for solutions. Emma wasn't an economist, but she knew enough to realize this wasn't a problem people could solve on their own. Wages weren't keeping up. Rent was outpacing salaries. Energy costs were crushing entire households. The government had announced temporary relief, energy price caps, tax breaks for small businesses, but it felt like putting a plaster on a broken dam. People needed long-term solutions. She saw protests in the news, strikes, people demanding fair wages and better policies. For the first time, she understood why. What can people do? The crisis wasn't going to disappear overnight, but Emma wasn't ready to give in to helplessness. She started looking into ways people were coping. Budgeting smarter, cutting unnecessary expenses, meal planning, and switching to cheaper brands. Community support. Food banks, local initiatives, even swapping unused goods with neighbours. Political pressure, signing petitions, attending protests, and pushing for better policies. Supporting small businesses, shopping locally instead of giving more money to massive corporations. No single solution would fix everything. But if people worked together, if they fought for real change, maybe things could start to turn around. A different perspective. As Emma lay in bed that night, she thought about her morning trip to Mr. Patel's shop. A few months ago, she wouldn't have noticed the price hikes. She wouldn't have cared about trade policies or inflation. But now, she saw things differently. This crisis wasn't just numbers on a screen. It was people. It was their lives. And that meant it was everyone's problem to solve. The cost of living was rising, but so was awareness. So was the demand for change. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step towards something better.